I think one of the things that the new atheists would say is that essentially there's no evidence for God. And I know, we spend our lives discussing and debating the various arguments and evidences for God's existence, but one of the most powerful arguments for atheism, I suppose, is a sort of broad encompassing of this, which you might call divine hiddenness, which is to say that God seems to hide. And that means that while there may be evidence of his existence, some people for some reason are insensitive to it. And maybe they're resistant, maybe they don't want it to be true or whatever, but it seems to me that there is at least one person in the world who genuinely wants to know God and just can't believe it, just doesn't, and maybe it's because they've been listening to too much Richard Dawkins and Hitchens, but again, that's kind of not their fault if that's just the culture they grew up in and that's what they were convinced by. You don't choose what to be convinced by, you just are or you're not. And so there's this problem of why some people seem not to want to meet God at all, and they get, blinding flashes of revelation, they get burning bushes and appearances and dreams and all this kind of stuff. And then there are those who spend their lives crying out for a sign.
Yes.
And they don't seem to get one. It seems arbitrary, and if God exists, maybe a little bit cruel.
Alex O'Connor opens the discussion with a very honest observation that resonates with many atheists and skeptics today. He explains that for some people, God can seem hidden no matter how sincerely they search or how deeply they seek for answers. At the same time, he acknowledges that others claim to have had powerful supernatural experiences that convince them God is real. And honestly, that creates a difficult but important tension in the conversation. This is what makes the discussion so interesting. The question isn't just about evidence, but also about personal experience, doubt, and the search for meaning. What follows is a thoughtful response from John Lennox as he carefully tackles this perspective with balance, reason, and clarity. Let's listen in.
I think there is a real mystery there. I'm very sympathetic to that because it is a question that I ask myself a lot because it was asked of me a lot.
Yeah.
Here I am coming from Northern Ireland and I arrive in Cambridge and almost the first thing I was asked when people heard me speak with a Northern Irish accent was, do you believe in God? Do you go to church? And then I remember the first one, and it happened very soon, early on. He said, oh, sorry, you're Irish, you Irish all believe in God, you fight about it. In other words, it's a cultural phenomenon. If you were born somewhere else, in another culture, you wouldn't have these beliefs. And I think to a certain extent that, of course, is true.
Yeah.
We are all influenced by our culture and the worldview of our upbringing. But what has helped me enormously in that, it hasn't solved the problem. There is a residual problem here, Alex. I'm with you on that. Is that it's possible for people to change their worldview. And I've seen that happen quite often. Secondly, it was by realizing that this was a problem that forced me, in a way, and it was force, to be open and vulnerable and allow counter-arguments into my personal space to investigate them without being afraid. Because there was a time I was afraid. I can remember very clearly walking up and down King's Parade in Cambridge, and I passed Mowbray's bookshop. And in the window there was a book. The title was Why I Am Not a Christian by Bertrand Russell.
Yes.
And I walked up and down. Dare I buy that book? Dare I buy it?
Yeah.
I bought it. And it was such a help to my faith because I realized that Russell, sadly, seems to have very little contact with genuine Christianity. The arguments
it wasn't very good, yeah.
No, it wasn't very good. But I think you're right. And I like the sensitivity with which you approach the question. There are people that don't want there to be a God and say so, and some of them are brilliant scientists. In fact, the philosopher of physics, what's his name, Nagel,
Thomas Nagel.
Thomas Nagel, New York, wrote an essay on this. I don't really want there to be a God. He's very honest. But yet he sees the difficulties in naturalism and wrote a whole book about it. So there are those that don't want there to be a God. But there are others that you sense are crying out, and why don't they believe? Now, one interesting sidelight on this, and it might be just a suggestion of someone you might be interested to interview. He's the only person in the world I know who holds simultaneously 3 chairs. Professor of nanotechnology, Professor of computer science, and Professor of chemistry. James Tour of Rice University. And week on week, he has a challenge on the internet. It's fascinating. And his challenge is this: if you would like to know why I believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus, is a very specific thing, I will meet you. And week after week, he's meeting people with exactly the same kind of sense of wanting to find out and crying out and all this kind of thing. I'll not spoil it by telling you what the result is, but it is fascinating. He's unique in my experience. And as I travel around, and I'm sure as you travel around, the great difficulty is it's very difficult to see into a person's experience. I visited Siberia quite a lot, and I was invited on one occasion to take part in a very high-powered conference organized by the Club of Rome, no less. I mentioned this in my book. And I was invited to give a talk, and I gave it was a short talk. And there was someone there from South America, a politician, and he lost his temper in the preliminary session. There was 400 or 500 of us, and he grabbed the microphone. He wouldn't wait his turn, got up and denounced me as being very dangerous indeed. It was an amazing situation. It was electrifying. So he went on and on and on, saying that this kind of talk would inspire revolution if we believed in all this kind of stuff, you see. So when he'd finished, I said to the chairman, look, give me 2 minutes. Oh, he said, no, you can't speak anymore. I said, look, 2 minutes and I'd stop. And I remember saying that I looked at him straight and addressed him. I said, you know, the God you don't believe in, I don't believe in either. It is God of the gaps kind of stuff. And secondly, I said, I'm on your side when you say that religion can be very dangerous. And I made some quip about, I suppose, that you would disbelieve in a watchmaker once you understood how a watch worked. And that caught him. And there was silence, and the thing went on. Afterwards he came and he said, we need to talk. I said, I think we do, and I'd be very happy to talk. I said, you've had a very bad experience, I'm afraid, of Christianity, haven't you? And he was quiet for a while. He said, I've had an awful experience. And it was abuse, you know, by people who were professing Christian clerics and so on. He said, how did you know? I said, I'll be frank with you, because what you were saying up front there was completely irrational. So I reckoned there was something deep. And we had a long talk, and we parted as friends. Over those few days, we had a long conversation. And that was one of the sharpest examples of someone who just was boiling with rage because of negative religious experience. And this is a tragedy, Alex, the way in which people have suffered. And it's one ground. It's not the only ground. And there are many different ones. But it's so difficult to see down into people's hearts and minds to know whether they have a genuine objection. And I think some people have a genuine objection. We started this conversation with it, that I meet people all through my life who say, look, I'd love to be able to believe like you do, but I can't. My family were murdered in the Holocaust or something like this. I sympathize with that. I don't trivialize that, because I think that's the hard objection. It is really hard. But I don't think atheism answers it. I think Christianity doesn't solve it like a question to be solved, but gives us a way in to cope with it, as I said in our last interview.
John Lennox responds by acknowledging that Alex's question comes from a genuine and honest place. But he also points out that not everyone approaches the question of God neutrally. Some people are deeply committed to a naturalistic worldview and actively try to explain reality without God altogether. What makes this discussion powerful is the role personal experience plays. While many people claim to have encountered supernatural experiences that strengthened their belief in God, others have gone through painful experiences connected to religion or suffering. And for many, that raises a difficult question: why would God allow such pain? John highlights something important here. Atheism struggles to fully answer the problem of suffering as well, but Christianity approaches it differently. Rather than ignoring suffering, it offers hope through the resurrection of Christ. The Christian message is that suffering is not the end of the story. According to the gospel, God promises restoration, purpose, and ultimately something far greater beyond human pain.
Yeah, well, sometimes you say, the problem of evil is the biggest problem for both Christians and atheists. And there is this line that sort of says, if you're an atheist and you say that there's a problem of evil, you need to be able to account for where evil comes from.
Yes, or what evil is.
Yeah, and I think that's fair enough, which is why I'm always careful to talk about what I'd rather call like the problem of suffering.
Yes,
which is
that's
to say,
okay.
I just wouldn't predict it's not that there would be no suffering whatsoever, but it's the arbitrariness of it, the intensity.
That's the hard bit.
Yes.
The apparent arbitrariness of it. Yes, absolutely.
And I know that there are people who... And the problem of evil and divine hiddenness are kind of versions of the same problem.
It is.
Which is, why does God allow bad things to happen? And I think that in individual cases, there are things you can say. But on the whole, I find it difficult to believe that there isn't at least one person who sincerely just cannot be convinced that God exists. And there's no boiling rage, there's no hatred, there's no resistance. They just can't believe it. And I also believe that there's at least one person who has suffered arbitrary, gratuitous suffering that could have easily been avoided had it been in accordance with the will of the sustainer of the universe. I find those two very difficult to disbelieve, and I also find them very difficult to square with the existence of a God who loves us all and wants to come to know us all.
As the discussion continues, both Alex O'Connor and John Lennox seem to agree on one thing. The problem of evil remains one of the biggest questions in both atheism and Christianity. But John pushes the conversation a step further. Before questioning why evil exists, there's also the deeper question of where evil actually comes from and how we even define it in the first place. Alex then narrows the focus to something more personal and relatable: human suffering. Why does God allow suffering, and what purpose could it possibly serve? This is a subject John Lennox has spent years thinking and speaking about. And in the next part of the discussion, he gives a thoughtful and fascinating response that challenges both skeptics and believers alike.
I share that question with you. I'll be totally open. The level of one's own personal experience then becomes important.
Yeah.
And I think I may have raised this last time, perhaps we didn't have time. It's because this is a real issue and not a trivial issue. The question for me is there any evidence, oblique or indirect evidence of any kind, that I can trust God with it? Now that's as hard a question, because you all know the undergraduate type of argument, surely a good God, where does Lucretius' problem, it's all of that, David Hume raised it, and all the rest. And we never get anywhere.
Yes. Ever.
And so I'm a mathematician, and when mathematicians have tried for a few hundred years to answer a question, they can't. They very sensibly try to change the question. And so I changed the question to that equally difficult one. Is there any evidence that we can trust God with it? And that's where my personal experience, based on the revelation in Scripture of the life of Jesus and the way he responded, not only to others' suffering, but his own suffering. That's where I see the way in. And that's where I see people who are really suffering being helped. What I mean by that, Alex, is this. There are two aspects and perspectives on this. The perspective we have at the moment sitting here is observing suffering. It's one thing to observe it, it's another thing to experience it.
Yes.
Now, most people are a mixture. They see gratuitous suffering here, they're suffering maybe a toothache themselves. But those two perspectives are different to a certain extent. And one needs intellectual answers, the other needs pastoral answers. And it seems to me that we need to have a pastoral understanding, which is, from my perspective, a deep sympathy, recognizing the depth of the objection you've raised, that it is real. It's not pretend. People aren't pretending. And the way you formulate it interests me, because you're the only one that's put it that way. And that is, I can't imagine that there isn't a person like this. Well, I just go with you. I can't either. So how does one approach people like that? But there's no generic person. They're individuals, and I find that all the time. People constantly ask me, what would you say to a person who? I said, unless I know that person, I wouldn't know what to say to them. I think people are too quick to provide what I would call a generic answer to a question, and it's meaningless because we're all individuals, and our psychology, our emotional experience goes very deep. And the key thing, it seems to me, that has guided me all my life, I must take you seriously. What you say, how you act, how you feel, how you think. And I must open myself up to the questions that are moving you at their deepest. To some of them, I will have no immediate answer. It would be foolish to claim. But I'll go away and think about those things in the hope that even within that context with a suffering person, I can show sufficient empathy to perhaps open a new window of opportunity to them. Like in New Zealand, when I got there just after the earthquake, and I had to give a whole lot of talks on this topic, and it wasn't easy, because natural disasters are harder than moral disasters. You know, we understand war and bombs, and
but what
earthquakes
they call
are different.
Acts of God.
Yes, that's right. And I spoke on this business about this other type of question, is there enough evidence to trust God? And as I finished one talk in the biggest congregation this church had had for years, in Christchurch, where the earthquake happened, a note was pushed into my hand as I left the platform. And I was told a lady had passed it in, and it just said this: I lost my husband in the earthquake. You have shown the first ray of light that I have had on this. And she signed it. I was deeply moved by that. She didn't get a solution in that sense. But she felt she'd seen a way in. And to my mind, Alex, it really is one of the evidences of the truth of Christianity, the array of people throughout history that have, in the deepest of suffering and all kinds of circumstances, how it is possible that even persecution refined the church and people were stronger. I'm amazed at that. And I've met some people who've shown immense courage, particularly in Siberia. People were in the Gulag and all this kind of thing. And they told me how God had helped them to face it. Now, you have to listen to people seriously. I remember one chap who really, in a sense, humiliated me, if I'm open about it. He was a very short chap for this height. And he told me he'd been put in the Gulag for 7 years because of his faith. He was teaching young people. And he just looked up at me and he said, "You couldn't face that, could you?" Well, I was so embarrassed.
Yeah.
I said, "No, I couldn't." And then he smiled. I'd never forget his smile. He said, "Nor could I." But he said, "You know, I discovered something." I said, "What was that?" "Well," he said, "when I went into the Gulag, I would faint at the sight of my own blood if I cut myself shaving. And I saw things there that no man should ever have to see in terms of gratuitous cruelty. But you know what?" he said, "I discovered that God comes in and he acts in the situation, not before it." And that has stuck with me for all of my life because it resonates with what Jesus said to his disciples when he told them they'd be brought before courts, they'd be tried, they'd be persecuted.
Yeah.
And that they would know in that hour. And I think there's enough evidence in my mind, personally, talking to people to whom it has happened, that this relationship with God is so real that in one sense it comes in to encourage people subjectively in situations that they cannot plan for, that are gratuitous, that are horrible, and supports them. To my mind, that's part of the evidence. And it's what I would expect to happen if Christianity is true.